Hello, welcome to the Rhode Island Small Business Coalition live forum. Sorry, it took me a second there. It's a hot day, and I'm just trying to get into the swing of things. As always, you can check out the Rhode Island Small Business Coalition at risbc.org. risbc.org is our website where you can find all the information about the coalition, sign up for our newsletter, and check out our social medias. Obviously, you're watching this on Facebook or other social media right now, and we are going to welcome our guest, Sarah Morgenthau. She is with us here, running for Congressional District 2 in Rhode Island. She's a candidate for the 2nd Congressional District. As you know, we've had many candidates on right now, and here's Sarah. Thank you. Welcome, Sarah.
David, thank you so much for having me. And I agree, it's pretty hot out there, but we will survive.
I just need to keep drinking so I don't get a little tongue tied there. Yeah, keep the hydration going. But thanks very much.
As you know, in Rhode Island, the weather can change in a heartbeat. So
absolutely true.
Fingers crossed on that one.
Absolutely true. So thank you very much for joining us today. We appreciate it. We've been interviewing all the candidates to see their views on small business as we've been going through this election season. And since you are, as I mentioned, a candidate for the 2nd Congressional District, why don't you tell our audience about yourself and give us a little background on you?
Yeah, thanks, David, and thanks again for having me here. And hello to everybody who is tuning in. My mother ran for this seat in 1988, and I like to start with that. I think it's important. Family is important. Family legacy is important. My brother and I ran her campaign. I was in law school at the time, and my mom was pretty gutsy. She was an immigrant to this country, the first in her family, along with her sister, to go to college, and the only one in her family that learned to drive. I also, on my father's side of the family, public service and giving back is something that I grew up with since I was a young girl, and it informed me. My grandfather was Secretary of Treasury under Roosevelt, and my great-grandfather served under President Wilson, and many of the Armenian folks here, where we have a small but mighty Armenian community in Rhode Island, know of the history of my great-grandfather calling out the atrocities of the genocide, both to the Turks in Constantinople and Washington. And some of those things I think have informed me throughout my life. It's what drove me to Washington to serve our country. And I worked in the Obama administration, helping to run the Peace Corps, working on food insecurity. 1 in 6 Rhode Islanders are dealing with food insecurity. Working on health security. This was before Ebola, before the pandemic. Where we understand better today as we're coming out of this, incredible time in our history, unimaginable, how important it is to have the health resources to be able to respond to public health crises around the world. Was there when we had to evacuate volunteers out of Crimea because Russia invaded in 2014, and was there when we responded to the earthquake in Haiti in 2010. I then went over to Homeland Security, where I headed up the private sector office, working on cybersecurity, counterterrorism, domestic terrorism, and worked closely with the business community, large and small, on the important national security issues, where it's important to have those public-private partnerships. It's important to have those dialogues, because there's a lot of things that we can do locally in the community to make sure that our communities are strong and resilient, and that we're providing those resources, and at the same time those opportunities for folks in our communities. Domestic terrorism is something that we are seeing today really rear its ugly head in a way, and it is important that not only law enforcement, but that also we have whole of community response, which requires mental health investments in mental health, social services, faith-based organizations. Then I was in the Biden administration heading up travel and tourism, and drove a new national travel and tourism strategy, where again I worked closely with the business community to make sure that businesses large and small had the resources that they need. As you know well, travel and tourism is an enormously important sector here in Rhode Island.
Yeah.
2019, it was $7 billion, going into the economy. We have 1 million people, a little over 1 million, 25, 27 million visitors day and night. And all the complications, David, that you know well, with making sure that our small businesses here have the resources that they need, and most importantly, have the resources that I will get when I go to Washington, to make sure that we stay strong here.
Fantastic. Thank you for bringing up those topics at the end there. We'll definitely want to dive into those a little bit more as I was looking at your website and looking at the things you detailed there. Clearly, a big part of the small business community here relies on tourism and travel, things of that nature. But I do have a question at the start. It's a little bit of a silly question, unfortunately, but we do have to ask it in this race. Where do you reside currently? Are you a resident of the second district?
Oh, absolutely. I'm in North Kingstown. I'm in Saunderstown. I'm sitting here right now. It has been our home and our constant for 40 years. It's the exact same place where we were when my mother was running. It's where my husband and I got married, in our backyard outside.
Oh, wow.
And Rhode Island has been our constant, has been our home, and my parents are not living any longer. But as I mentioned earlier, I come from a family where public service and giving back, like so many Rhode Islanders, really has informed me. I am really just impressed and enthused as I travel from community to community, from Block Island to Exeter to North Kingstown, South Kingstown to Johnston, where I was last night, Cranston, Warwick, Burrillville, at the investments that all of us are making in our communities, because we believe how important it is that we keep it strong for our children and for our grandchildren. But I was in Washington, as I mentioned, serving in 2 administrations,
Right.
working on issues that are important to Rhode Islanders. And I think there's a huge excitement about those relationships that I have, the work that I have done across many different sectors, because, it's not easy in Washington right now. It's divisive, it's noisy, it's overly partisan. And we need to make sure that we have the right woman in Congress, really fighting for our communities to bring things back, that has the experience driving policies, driving strategies.
Well, let's start there then. I mean, since you brought it up, it is a question I've asked all the congressional candidates, and it's a hard one to answer. But how do you feel you can be successful in this role with all the divisiveness and with the so much gridlock going on?
Yeah, David, I'm glad you asked it, and I think I'm going to approach it exactly like I've approached everything, in my life and in my career, which is being a problem solver, coming with a heck of a lot of experience, working on a lot of issues, many of the issues which have been devoid of partisan politics. I've worked on food insecurity, I've worked on health security, I've worked on domestic terrorism, I've worked on counterterrorism. Worked on cybersecurity, worked closely, with the private sector, which means, with the business community, worked on travel and tourism. And, these are really about, identifying problems, staying local here and making sure that I'm accessible, that I'm hearing, what our issues are, and then going to Washington and using, the relationships that I have there so that I can hit the ground running, on day one. And, I think the other thing I'd like to bring up too is that we haven't had a woman in this seat in over 30 years. We've actually never had a Democratic woman ever go to Congress from Rhode Island. And I do think that the woman's perspective is important in these complicated times. I think that we bring a fresh perspective, an ability to understand issues in a different way, and Rhode Islanders are excited about that. I think women are excited about that. We have strong women here in Rhode Island, many of whom are small business owners, and I think they're excited about working with me as I go to Washington, knowing what it is that my job is on day one.
Excellent. Yeah, no, absolutely true. The majority of our coalition are women business owners, especially coming out of the pandemic. A lot of women, unfortunately, had to leave their jobs or lost their jobs, and became the primary child care people because of the pandemic, and then decided, now's the time to start a business. So we've got many members in that realm right now, especially minorities as well. So it's good to keep that in mind.
Yeah, and David, I'm really glad that you brought that up because I think that's really Exhibit A about the importance of women and how resourceful we often are in these really difficult times. And as you mentioned, women were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And it's that perspective, because it's often, I have three kids. I had parents who were older. I talk about being in the sandwich generation, navigating, all of those things. And those were just exacerbated
Right.
during the pandemic, when we were struggling with family, work, older parents getting sick, some dying, children at home, and how to balance all of that and make sure that they were getting access, educated access, and then the huge mental health burden that went on to our young people. And, it takes me about 10 seconds, to look in the eyes of women across this district and be like, I get it, we get it. And that's the women's perspective that I'm talking about, that's so important. And it's not just because, of the difficulties of all that we've endured, during this pandemic, but also because, history was just made in a way that we couldn't have imagined with the Roe v. Wade decision being overturned. And so if there was ever a time to send a woman, I think this would be the time, so that we can make sure that we're really getting done what we need to get done.
Agreed. A much bigger topic for a different conversation. Let's turn back to small business. I agree with you completely, but let's turn back to small business. And you did, mention all the difficulties of the pandemic, and you mentioned earlier, hospitality and tourism really badly impacted by the pandemic. And thankfully there were some good federal programs that came along and helped out, the EIDL loans and things of that nature. But really, one of the hardest hit sectors, especially here in Rhode Island, tourism, it was just destroyed. Thankfully, it seems to be on its way back. I've been in Newport this summer. It's busy. It's good to see. Providence is still, I think, getting there. Talk to us about your thoughts there, and what do you see as what you could do as a congressperson to improve the situation?
Yeah, and I'm glad, David, that you brought up, because I've had a lot of conversations locally about the unevenness, if you will, in travel and tourism, just across our state, which I think, is a reflection of what we see across the country, right? Which is that Newport
Right.
did do pretty well, which is, as you know, in the first congressional district, not in my district, whereas Providence and other places were disproportionately impacted, in part because of the big hit on business travel. I think,
Yeah.
what you saw, as you know, travel and tourism, is, defined, by leisure, by healthcare. Folks come, for our great healthcare in this country, education, and business was really disproportionately impacted. But what I see my job as is making sure that I stay local, which is what I am doing, talking to our communities, talking to our small businesses, identifying, what it is that's needed. and then helping to make sure that we get the resources, the federal resources, right? Which there are many. I mean, there are resources that are coming out of the Commerce Department that are helping, which that have been earmarked for travel and tourism. There's SBA, small business loans. There's tax incentives that are needed. Yeah, I think we need to make sure that we work on supply chain issues. That's hit our small
Sure.
businesses really hard. I'm pleased that we are signing the semiconductor chips legislation. I think we need to continue to make sure that we are not overly reliant on other countries for our supply chain. Workforce shortage has hit us across the board. It's disproportionately impacted travel and tourism, in part because it's high contact, right? Many businesses are able to move to virtual opportunities in travel and tourism. You got to be there. And so that has made it really difficult. And so I think if there was ever an opportunity for comprehensive bipartisan immigration reform, I think that cuts across party lines. And it is something that I want to make sure that we work on. There are things too, like the national travel and tourism strategy that I drove, heading that up at Commerce, is making sure that the United States of America is remaining a leader. And that we're attracting international visitors, and that part of that is about marketing. There are grants that are available for our small businesses here to make sure that we can market, if you will, our fantastic assets, so that international visitors too, who are increasingly looking for diverse and different kinds of opportunities,
Yeah.
and the authenticity, David, of what we have here in the great ocean state. The other thing too, David, is that I was the highest ranking official on travel and tourism, and you can I give you my promise, my word, that folks in Washington are going to hear about what it is that we have here, and that we will work together to make sure that we have the resources and that we lift up so that we can continue to grow the economy and in a way that makes sense for all of us.
Excellent point. Something new at the next convention. I am the food guy and I love calamari, but we need to be more than calamari. Nothing wrong with it. I'm not. Everyone out there, squid is our #1 export. It's huge, but
Right.
uh,
And David, that's important that you're saying that, because one of the things that I talk about is, the relationships that I have, the experience that I have, both on the global stage, on the national stage. And that's important, right? Because we want to stay local and we want to grow the state, but we want to make sure that we are identifying the different kinds of ideas, taking the different kinds of opportunities, convening the right people together so that we can really build common sense, practical solutions, and ultimately bring the resources back to the state.
yeah. Let's talk about. You mentioned a tax credit. I think a lot of times people think of tax credits. They don't think of small businesses. Which we'd like to change. Obviously, they think of the Amazons and the giant corporations of the world that get these credits to come to different states and set up facilities. What are you thinking there when you say tax credits for small business?
Well, I think that there are small businesses deserve to get a tax break, right? So because I think it's really difficult, and so we want to make sure that that's something that's high on the list.
And any particular thoughts on how that would work? A lot of times here in the state, we've tried to, have these conversations with our Commerce Department, and I'm not criticizing them. I think it's understandable. It's easy for them to wrap their heads around an entity like an Amazon and say, okay, they're building this $1 billion facility, so this is their tax rate, and so on and so forth. How do you do that with smaller businesses? What any thoughts there?
I think that there is federal legislation that is already, being introduced, and that I would continue to lead on and work to drive, that would give tax breaks to smaller businesses. And again, one of the things I talk about, David, is, that these issues for small businesses really kind of cross party lines. And
Yeah.
I think that that's important, right? So this is not a partisan issue. This is an issue about how do we get the resources, how do we pass the legislation so that our small businesses, can thrive. And I can tell you, because I have worked with U.S. Travel Association, I have worked closely with industry across the country. That these are issues that are touching not just Rhode Island, but other states where travel and tourism is a big economic driver, money into the economy and jobs. And so I look forward to working with those colleagues to make sure that I can introduce legislation and get it passed, and feel pretty confident that we can do that, with Republicans and Democrats alike, because they have been champions on these issues. I worked with them on these issues, when we were talking about the National Travel and Tourism Strategy.
Excellent. Well, let's turn to jobs. Let's as you know, unemployment at a record low number, which is great to hear. When you look at the economy, but it's definitely a struggle for small businesses. I have this conversation almost every day with my friends in the coalition and elsewhere. Workforce is just not there to hire people. It's very it's bewildering in many senses. I mean, we're not sure why. I think there's a lot of different factors. As we've talked about on the show before in the past, you talk about small business, housing factors in, healthcare factors in. There's a lot of other things that you don't think of as small business, but they definitely factor into how small businesses work. What are your thoughts on the workforce right now and the yes, excellent. I'm not going to debate that the unemployment number is excellent to hear, but how hard it is for people to find employees. What do you think can be done there?
No, I mean, David, this is a big issue, right? And it's not an issue just that Rhode Island's dealing with. It's not
Right.
just small businesses. It's not just travel and tourism. And again, we're seeing it across the country. And I think there've been a lot of drivers because of it. I think that people have made decisions for various different reasons to exit from the workforce. I think you've seen older folks, frankly, who've made a decision that maybe this is the end of the road for them. I think that and gone into a different direction. Started something different. You mentioned earlier, which to me is exciting, is that many women who have gone through difficult times, and I've seen that play out firsthand, have started small businesses, and have been able to pivot, to adapt quickly to that. So, we need to work on comprehensive immigration reform. We need to make sure that we are bringing in folks from around the world to increase the supply of our workers. We also need to make sure that we are creating and cultivating pipeline for different sectors that makes sense for our state, right? Whether it's travel and tourism, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's investments, and a lot of the great new work that we're going to be doing in the blue and green economy, something that Rhode Island has been a leader on. The Inflation Reduction Act, huge billions of dollars investments in it. We need to make sure that we're cultivating and training, if you will, workers to go into all of these areas, so that we have what we need to keep these businesses growing. So there's a lot of work that we need to do on this. I think it's a priority, and one of the things that I talk about often, David, is that we need to make sure that we have the right person in Congress who understands, their short, medium, and long-term goals. And there are certain things that, that we can do on the short term to provide a little bit of relief. I think, you saw President Biden doing that early on, coming up with a vaccine and passing the stimulus legislation that provided some relief, much needed during the pandemic. At the same time, we can't keep our eye off of, medium and long-term goals. And one of those right now is supply chain, skills gap. Things are changing so rapidly. Technology is changing everything that we do really rapidly. And so we need to make sure that we are training workers so that they are then able to go into the jobs that we are creating as we are rapidly changing,
Yeah.
right? And comprehensive immigration reform.
It certainly does address workforce, especially with the training. It's a really big topic. And I'm not sure there's an easy way to answer it, but what are your thoughts on supply chain? What it's really just perplexing where we are right now. And is there something you think that Congress can do?
Well, I'm pleased that we are about to sign the semiconductor chips legislation. That was a long, hard fight, and I think it's something that we saw really rear its ugly head during the pandemic when supply chain became an enormous issue. We all remember, the images of the shelves in our grocery stores, whether it was, baby formula, diapers, wipes, Clorox,
Yep.
and,
I'm still seeing those things. It's not
we're
those products, but
yeah.
different products. It's still
No, I
still
know.
happening.
I just, just the other day, there wasn't any milk. So, I don't know what's up with that, right?
Right.
And it continues to have that ebb and flow. I'm pleased that we are signing the semiconductor chips legislation. I think that's an enormous victory for us. We need to continue to make sure that we are not overly dependent on other countries for our supply chain. And it's twofold, right? We don't want to be overly reliant. We've seen this play out, with the war in Ukraine through the pandemic. But also, it's important because the more that we're making here, the more jobs that we're creating for folks, and I think that that's really important. And it goes back to David to what I was saying, which is that we need to continue to understand that these are crises, and we can't lose our focus because there are so many things that come at us, daily, hourly, weekly. And we want to make sure that we have experienced people in Washington who have worked on these issues, who have worked on many different crises, as I have, whether it's been food insecurity, health security at Peace Corps, domestic terrorism, counterterrorism. You may remember the TSA wait times crisis, which we had in 2015, 2016, when we had those really long lines at our airports, and it took forever to get through. And so we don't want to forget those things, and we want to make sure that you have the right person in Washington who has that experience, who will keep sounding the alarm bells to make sure that we get these things done.
Well, you mentioned food insecurity, and I try not to, since my world is food, I try not to bring in too much into the show. But I think, an extremely important part of that I try to impress folks. I used to try to impress this upon Governor Raimondo at all times. Is manufacturing. All those small businesses we have here in Rhode Island that do food production at some level, whatever the product may be, whatever the farm may be, is a manufacturing business essentially. And the more we do here, and not just in Rhode Island but across the country, the more secure we'll be. So I think that's important that you brought that up, and I just wanted to reinforce that as well.
It is really important, David, and I'm glad you brought it up. And I think one of the things that I'm bringing with that global perspective is many of our developing countries around the world early on understood the importance of being sustainable because they had to be. There was
Right.
no choice, right? So you didn't have the grocery stores or the option, or frankly, the ability to move things, from farm to market. And I think that we are now understanding that even better as we are wrestling with food insecurity, with supply chain issues here in this country, and understanding the importance of building up that capacity and making our local communities really strong. Again, something that I've talked to folks about in Richmond, in Exeter, because we have rural communities too, which need to make sure that they are getting the resources, which goes back again to the importance of staying local, staying accessible, with our communities, because without that understanding of what we need here to make it stronger for our children and for our grandchildren, I'm not going to be, in Washington driving things that aren't important to us. I want to be accountable, I want to be accessible, and really get things done.
Thank you. One more, since you mentioned, rural communities, and we have a lot of them in the western and southern part of the state that isn't part of the second congressional district. One more big topic I want to bring up, so we'll try and cover it a bit before we wrap, is infrastructure. Because I think people don't think of infrastructure sometimes as something that applies to small businesses, but obviously it's key. If it's not there, people can't get to small businesses. People can't make your small business function in some cases. What are your thoughts there as a congressperson on our infrastructure here?
We need some work on our roads, David.
It's the easy thing to say, but you're absolutely right. As someone today who's just driving in East Greenwich and thinking, why are the roads so bad here? You're right.
They truly are, and we need to continue, to invest in our infrastructure, because if we can't get there, then that's going to be a problem. We need to make sure that that we are building and rebuilding our infrastructure so that it is ready for the effects of climate change, for the soaring natural disasters that that we experience on a more and more regular basis. Fortunately, there has been a big priority on infrastructure, which I think is enormously important, and goes back again to these things are important to us, David. And when we think about the fact that we have a Democratic majority in the House who is prioritizing, affordable housing, lowering the costs of prescription drugs, making sure we have access to health care, making sure that we're investing, billions of dollars, to fight against climate change into our blue and green economies, which lowers costs, creates jobs. Passing the veterans legislation just the other day for folks who have suffered in the burn pits. These are our veterans, people who have served in our country and at the highest level, and we need to make sure that we are taking care of them. Right now, I believe that I drive the strongest contrast against Alan Fung. He had Kevin McCarthy in here the other day. He put out a press release against the Inflation Reduction Act. And I think it's important that we have the right Democrat. We need a woman. We need someone with a woman's perspective. We need someone who's experienced, that can really get things done. Or we could lose this seat, and that could mean losing the majority in the House. So these are consequential things that play out, in Washington on the national stage, but are impacting us here at home. So what I say to voters is, please, you can do something about this. You can exercise your vote. You can tell your neighbors, go out and vote for Sarah Morgenthau, because she's going to get things done. And together we can do this, and your voice will be heard. So voting starts on the 24th of this month and goes through to September 13th. Please go to sarahmorgenthau.com. And check out my website, and always welcome any thoughts or volunteers. But our democracy is on the line here. We've seen what can play out with January 6th. These things are important, and we need to make sure that we keep the majority in the House, and that means nominating the right candidate on the Democratic side that draws the greatest contrast.
Well, thank you for that. I was going to ask if you had any closing comments, but it sounded like you wrapped up pretty beautifully there. As you said, sarahmorgenthau.com is the website, and the primary date is Tuesday, September 13th. September 13th, though you can vote early in I think just about every city in town now in Rhode Island. You can go to your town hall or your board of canvassers and vote early, starting in a couple weeks. But the primary date is Tuesday, September 13th. Sarah Morgenthau, thank you very much for your time today. I appreciate it.
David, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Take care. Well, that was another wonderful conversation. Hope you enjoyed that. It's great to learn a lot about these candidates. As always, There it is on the screen. Thank you, Ben. You can join the coalition at risbc.org. Find us on all the socials and join us again for the next forum episode. We'll be interviewing another candidate running for office this year. Thank you. Take care.